Although Netflix's The Umbrella Academy is only 2 seasons deep, one thing about the family that serves as the focal point of this story seems abundantly clear. They are absolutely abysmally awful at their jobs. After the bizarre births of some seemingly extraordinary children, Sir Reginald Hargreeves set out to purchase as many of these oddities as possible with one singular purpose behind it in mind: using these exceptional kids to save the world. Although Reginald only managed to acquire 7 of these baby flukes, each of the Hargreeves children were gifted with some extremely unusual superpowers that seemed to set all of them up for a successful life as superheroes. Reginald raised them with the most rigorous superhuman training that he could devise, and he explicitly intended for his children to save the world. However, after nearly 2 decades of training and experience, along with a few major bumps in the road, the vast majority of the Umbrella Academy decided to leave the life of the hero behind. But despite the fact that the children were raised to save the world, it seems like they can't help but end it. The family has been estranged for years, but now, over the course of 2 seasons, they've managed to end the world twice, and in both instances it was just mere days after reuniting as a family. So, why the hell do all the Hargreeves kids suck at life so hard? Although the Hargreeves clan is supposed to be a squad of superheroes, the reality of the situation is that they are truly just a group of neglected and traumatized children who were not equipped to deal with adulthood. And their lack of ability to cope seems to have catastrophic consequences for the rest of the world. However, each one of the children is dysfunctional in their own way. Luther is the assigned leader of the Umbrella Academy, but it's painfully, awkwardly obvious that Allison might be the only one to even possibly defer to Luther in an emergency situation. It is very interesting, though, that Reginald has made Luther his number 1. Clearly, Luther doesn't have the necessary leadership skills to keep his siblings on task, but he also arguably has one of the least useful superpowers of the entire group. So then, why is he number 1? Well, the obvious answer seems to be that, while he's not the most powerful, he may be the most useful to Reginald, because he's the only one of Reginald's children who actually toes the company line. He is the only person who has truly committed his life to Reginald's failed experiment, so even if he's the least powerful, he provides the most utility to Reginald. In Reginald's eyes, it's easy to see why Luther may have been the most important. However, through the eyes of a normal human being, it's easy to see why Luther's experience growing up in the Umbrella Academy and his experience as number 1 was so psychologically damaging to him. Luther seems to go to great lengths to seek approval and love, specifically from people who always deny him. And this self-sabotaging behavior seems to be reflected in many of the largest and smallest aspects of Luther's life. Luther shouldered a disproportionate amount of blame for ending the world in Season 1. Yes, his actions did have the direst consequences that any actions can have, but it's not at all difficult to understand his train of thought. Firstly, he's the only member of the Hargreeves family who has never been able to escape his abuser. Luther's entire self-identity is designed around what Reginald has taught him, and his overly simplistic idea of what a hero is and how he needs to lead his family is one of the many ways in which Luther demonstrates that he has truly not experienced life outside of his abusive childhood. Secondly, it should come as no surprise at all that Luther's first instinct on how to handle Vanya is to do exactly what Reginald would have done. Despite the fact that no one actually remembers Vanya being locked up, Luther's reaction to the threat that Vanya poses is astonishingly predictable given that he is built by Reginald's design. But finally, while Luther's actions are obviously the incorrect ones, clearly his assumptions about the threat that Vanya posed were absolutely correct. There were very few reasonable courses of action when the family realized that Vanya was not only powerful, but had become dangerously unstable surprisingly quickly. Luther did take the wrong course of action, but there was really nothing wrong with his thought process behind it, and ironically it was likely only Reginald's extended isolation of Vanya in her childhood that led to Luther's imprisonment of her in adulthood, causing such apocalyptic consequences. Although Luther is a product of his environment, it's clear that he takes his duties as a real-life superhero seriously. And interestingly, even though he was the last child to extricate himself from Reginald, and he didn't extricate himself willingly, he has actually shown himself to be one of the most easily self-reflective and self-critical characters in Season 2 of the Umbrella Academy. Luther made an enormous mistake because he recognized that Vanya was a powder keg ready to explode. but the choices that he made actually caused that bomb to go off. When he sees Vanya again, it's understandable that his first instinct is to eliminate the threat at any cost. But after just a few moments of consideration, he takes responsibility for his own actions, he recognizes that he needs to change, and he acknowledges that Vanya deserves the opportunity to change as well. Ironically, one of his first choices as an individual that isn't directed and controlled by Reginald is exactly the kind of decision that a good leader would make, which really goes to show how much Reginald's influence had stifled Luther's growth as a person. If you're not first, you're last. Despite the fact that Diego is outwardly the most resistant to the training and indoctrination that his abusive father foisted upon him, it seems like Diego's position as number 2 is how he has defined himself for his entire life. The effect that Reginald's abuse had seems to be the most obvious with Diego out of anyone in the family, because it controls every aspect of his being. Everything that Diego thinks, says, or does is in reaction to his realization and understanding that he was raised by an abusive monster, as well as his deep and unyielding desire to experience true parental love in a way that was always denied him. It's intriguing but understandable that, despite hating his father more than anyone, Diego wound up becoming his number 2. Because although Diego seems to mold himself in a reactionary way against everything that his father taught him, he's still the most ardently heroic member of the family, even more so than Luther. Interestingly, despite the fact that Diego appears to be the most aggressive and brash member of the family, it seems like whenever he makes an attempt to express any of his sincere or deep emotions, he has a lot of trouble doing so directly, both in the literal sense, due to his stutter, but also in an emotional and psychological sense too. Like many of the Hargreeves kids, Diego's form of dysfunction almost seems to be an extension of his own superpower. He can literally adjust the trajectory of flying objects when they're already in flight, and his life's obsession seems to be redirecting his heroic story arc in the direction that he wants to see it go, instead of along the path that his father set out for him. However, it's still incredibly telling and meaningful that Diego still defines himself by the heroic archetype that his father forced onto him when he was a child. Similarly, Diego seems to be equally conflicted in his feelings towards his siblings. He at times embraces them, at times resists them, and he always wants to seem to redefine the relationships that they all have on his terms instead of his father's terms. And the fact that he is so ardent that they all be a part of Team Zero when he spent his entire life playing the role of number 2 just goes to show that while he seems to rebel against everything that Reginald forced upon him, he still defines himself, his family, and the world in the terms that the Hargreeves patriarch laid out for him. On the surface, it would seem like Allison is the Hargreeves sibling who has gotten the closest to achieving a relatively normal life, and who is the most capable of relating to others on a more healthy and normal psychological level. But it's still clear that her power defines how she relates to people and relates to the world, whether or not she's actually using it at the time. Clearly, her relationship with Luther is her most important familial bond. And while she doesn't seem to share Luther's more romantic interest in her, she does seem to be very keen to lean into the person that Luther sees her as. And it's an understandable impulse, since it would appear that she doesn't use her powers on Luther or anyone else in her family besides Vanya. So he's one of the few people whose interpretation of her she can actually rely on to be truthful. But even when Allison can't or won't use her superpowers, her attempts at relating to other people or to society at large seem to be mostly driven by a need to control, redirect, or otherwise influence their way of thinking, even if they're extremely resistant to it. Of course, this isn't an entirely uncommon behavior, and it's an attitude that can be enormously beneficial in some situations, while enormously detrimental in others. However, the damage that Reginald has done to Allison is readily apparent because, regardless of the fact that she has been able to form deeper and more complex interpersonal relationships than any of her siblings, she still has no understanding of how to relate to people outside of her power. And why would she? Allison's constant attempts at creating a normal life that seem to inevitably fail are not just failures because she's a superhuman trying to live in a human world. It's because she never had a fully dimensional and fleshed out human experience as a child. She wasn't seen as a person, but as a power, so she only knows how to develop or maintain relationships in which she exercises some sort of psychological control over the people she's engaging with, regardless of whether or not she's actually using her power in order to do it. Klaus is undeniably one of the most compelling characters in the entire series, and it's easy to see why his childhood trauma has resulted in such extreme behavior and personality traits in his adulthood. Reginald is a parent who did an exceptionally poor job of socializing his own children in a way that would help them function in the real world. But that lack of appropriate parenting seems like it would have the most extreme impact on Klaus, because Klaus's power is inherently social. Seeing ghosts would be terrifying for any child and pretty much any adult on Earth. But for a child who has no idea how to interact or relate to others, it could be an utterly crippling ability to have. It's clear that the ghosts that Klaus typically sees are spirits who have some sort of unfinished business left in the world. And not only would any child be astonishingly incompetent when it came to dealing with those kinds of emotionally and psychologically complex situations, the fact that Klaus's father mostly psychologically neglected and occasionally outright terrorized him meant that he had a very mentally draining and damaging power and was given no tools or coping skills with which to deal with them. More than any other member of the Hargreeves family, it's Klaus that does everything that he can in order to escape his power, which is ironic considering that it was the only characteristic that his father seemed to think was relevant about him. But Klaus's desire to dull his senses by any means necessary was a rational response from a poorly emotionally developed person that was stuck in an astoundingly bizarre and psychologically taxing situation. In a sense, none of the siblings were failed by Reginald quite as much as Klaus was. And that is a truly tragic result of Klaus's exceptional abilities. It's very telling that Klaus seems to occupy some metaphysical space between life and death that allows him to commune with the dead, but he's also terrified of losing the ones that he loves to death. If most people knew with any degree of certainty that the afterlife was real, let alone if they could actually commune with the dead, it would be a huge relief. But Klaus lied to Ben about going into the light because he was afraid to lose him, and he spent most of the second season doing whatever he could to save Dave from certain death. But why? Well, because his father made his own abilities, and the dead, into his source of constant terror. Interestingly, despite the fact that he spent the least amount of time with Reginald out of all of his siblings, it seems like Five's utilitarian attitude towards heroism mirrors his father's the most closely out of anyone. It's easy to see why that would be the case, but the fact that Five's reaction to the most extreme trauma that any of the Hargreeves kids have endured is to act more like Reginald is a strong indication of how abuse and generational trauma can affect an individual as well as an entire family. However, there is one stark difference between Five and Reginald. While Five has a very easy time grasping the greater good in any morally difficult situation, he still goes out of his way to prioritize the health, safety, or survival of his family wherever he can. With all of the Hargreeves children, there is an element of conflict that arises from the fact that they were raised being told that they had to save humanity, but they were also raised in a way that completely disconnected them from humanity. And with no character is that conflict more apparent than with Five. Five is ready and willing to sacrifice nearly anyone that he feels he must on the altar of the greater good. But his emotional connection to his family is extremely strong. And even in the most dire of circumstances, it seems like he always keeps them as his priority. It's an interesting dichotomy for the character, because the distance between him and the rest of his siblings is larger and longer, both literally and psychologically, than anyone else in the Hargreeves family. But he seems to be almost entirely oriented around his family at the expense of himself. And it's certainly a sharp contrast with his father. His father seems to have reacted to world-ending trauma by ensuring that he would have no familial bond with his children, but Five has reacted to it by holding on to his familial bonds as if they're the only thing in the world that matters. Although the trauma that Five experienced in the post-apocalyptic world, as well as during his tenure as a time-traveling assassin, is probably far worse than the trauma that he experienced as a child being raised by Reginald Hargreeves, becoming the survivor of an apocalyptic holocaust led him to most clearly mirror and contrast the parent who spent his entire life raising him with the intent of preventing another apocalyptic holocaust. Most of the Hargreeves siblings seem to have some sort of connection between their power and their personality, either because of nature or nurture. So it's fascinating that Ben seems to be diametrically opposed to his. His ability to summon and partially transform into some horrific eldritch creature seems to completely contrast to his innocent, sweet, and generally kind disposition. But why is that? Ironically, Ben seems to be the most well-adjusted member of the Hargreeves family, and it's not hard to speculate that his maturity might actually be driven by the fact that he died young. He was subjected to the abusive and neglectful parenting of Reginald, just like the rest of his siblings. But through death, he actually wound up escaping his abuser. So, while his literal growth came to an abrupt end, it seems like his personal growth may have actually begun there. On the one hand, it seems like Ben's behavior is an obvious signifier of the fact that his life stopped at a relatively young age. However, a lot of Ben's behavior and overall outlook on life seems to be exceptionally childlike, even for someone who died as a teenager. And that, in combination with the fact that he seems to be so well adjusted in relation to his other family members, begs the question of whether or not death finally allowed Ben to have the childhood that he deserved but never had. Either way, it certainly says a lot that the two most well-adjusted members of the Hargreeves family either spent most of their lives in an apocalyptic hellscape or literally dead. Poor number 7. Being relegated to the least important member of your family is never an easy position to occupy for anyone. But it seems like Vanya is the purest and most clear manifestation of all of Reginald's failings as a parent and teacher. There are a lot of curious complexities to Vanya, and it's obvious that having no real human parental influence is almost certainly why she became the most dangerous member of the Umbrella Academy, despite not even using her powers for most of her life. Reginald's fatal mistake with Vanya was his belief that constantly reminding her of how unspecial she was would lead her to never becoming dangerous enough to do real damage to the world. But his assumption of what would be the best way to handle her seems to be based on an incorrect conclusion that he drew based on Vanya's behavior towards her nannies. It's quite an odd dynamic, because while Vanya seems to have extremely negative reactions towards the nannies that try to parent her, Vanya's behavior in general has demonstrated her to be an extremely emotional, empathetic, and kind individual who doesn't want to hurt anyone or anything. So why did she keep on lashing out at the women who were being hired to care for her? Well, because she is someone who never had experienced a human parent-child dynamic, and therefore she lashed out emotionally when that dynamic was suddenly thrust upon her. Vanya may have become dangerous after years of being horribly abused, but what's sad about the trajectory of her life is that she clearly had an abundance of emotion, much of it positive emotion, that she was desperate to express but couldn't. Given that she has very quickly fallen in love twice over the course of 2 seasons, it's painfully obvious that she feels like she has a lot of love to give and no one to give it to. But it's also tragically clear that she doesn't know how to differentiate between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy one. Vanya dedicated her life to expressing herself through music, which is clearly deeply connected to the latent superpower that had been repressed for her entire life. But as a result of that enforced repression, she even felt like a complete failure at that. So, while everyone at the Umbrella Academy contributed to Vanya's meltdown in some way, the honest truth seems to be that nothing could have been done to prevent it. After a literal lifetime of total repression, abuse, and neglect, there was no other way for Vanya's abuse, or the abuse of all of the Hargreeves children, to end. Of course, as the patriarch of the Hargreeves family, Reginald Hargreeves is truly the architect of his children's dysfunction. They all react to his neglect and abuse in their own way, but ironically the entire reason that the Umbrella Academy seems to repeatedly fail in its sole mission is because of Reginald's single-minded focus on that mission. The Hargreeves children are doomed to destroy the world because all Reginald ever cared about was saving it. Reginald is literally an alien, but the literal and metaphorical implications of a group of children who are raised in a world that separates them from their humanity is a rich textual and subtextual aspect of the Umbrella Academy. Reginald himself is not a suitable parent to his children, but all of the outside influences that he allows on his children are literally not human either. Grace and Pogo provide some basic functional emotional satisfaction to the Hargreeves children, but they're still not people. They don't help the children to understand humanity or human existence any better, and they still serve to separate the Umbrella Academy from the very world that they're meant to protect. On the whole, Reginald's abject failure as a parent, teacher, and creator is a fantastic allegory for the nature of generational trauma. Reginald is a failure as a parent for many reasons, but ultimately Reginald is a being who is extremely traumatized by the destruction of his own world, and as a parent, he passed down that trauma to his own children. In that sense, the failure of the Umbrella Academy to live up to its potential solely rests on the failings of Reginald himself. But despite the fact that he was a terrible father, and despite the fact that he is more responsible for the apocalypse than literally anyone else on Earth, his story still feels like a tragic one. His lived experience is one of extreme trauma, and his legacy is one of a sincere attempt to save the world from that same trauma, but a sincere attempt that was made by someone who was completely unequipped to do it. With his singular and absolutely obsessive focus on saving the world, Reginald not only destroyed his family, he ensured that they would inevitably destroy the planet that they were meant to save.